I personally view Avalanche as a system that can really be interoperable with anything. I think I could say the same thing with other ecosystems as well. And so hopefully you have this future outcome of all these different ecosystems that are now just so interoperable. And honestly, ideally, that kind of stops or minimizes the tribalism that exists in our space.
Don't worry, we are friends.
Okay guys, welcome back to the FRENS VALIDATOR YouTube channel. This is a YouTube channel you should subscribe to if you want to stay on top of everything what's happening in the proof of stake and staking industry. And today I'm pleased to welcome Jay Kurahashi-Sofue to the show. He is from Ava Labs, and man, it has been a while. We have recorded an interview like in a crazy bull one in 2021, and now we are here. How are you doing?
Doing so well. We were hanging out in Barcelona, I think a month ago, different times, good energy, good vibes. I know you guys are getting geared up for Cosmoverse too, so super excited to kind of see the rest of the year out with some amazing stuff.
Yeah, 100%. It's and it's so cool to have you on again. But yeah, you mentioned that we are like more from the Cosmos side of things. So I think what would be useful here is just to draw like a small comparison here, like straight to the point. So Avalanche, like a small Avalanche architecture overview with the exchange chain, the P chain, and the contract chain, and where the subnets come into play. And then we can like draw a small comparison to Cosmos and app chains.
Especially when you think about Cosmos, I always think through, and also thinking back when we first met and actually learning more about Cosmos through the lens of the operators and builders. I've known about Cosmos for a long time, but not so deeply ingrained. It's kind of like these chains are all kind of types of fruits, but they're just different fruits, right? And so for Cosmos, there's a bunch of different languages. There's a bunch of languages meaning like different terminology, different use cases maybe, or slightly different use cases. And I think both ecosystems have viable tech, have really viable direction and strategy. They're just different philosophies kind of underlying a lot of what we do and a lot of what you guys do, or a lot of what the Cosmos community does. And so when you think about the architecture for Avalanche, you have this horizontally scaling platform, chain of chains, effectively, or networks of networks. And so you have what you just referenced, XCP. Those are just the main chains that Avalanche started off with. It was part of what we call the primary network. And so these different chains have different use cases. The primary chain is a metadata chain. It's really to manage all of the validator overhead and kind of the ops of validation. There's the X chain, or the exchange chain, which is a DAG, and it is just used for simply trading assets as quickly as possible without any particular order. And then the contract chain is for smart contracts. Actually, one correction might be, I think now that the exchange chain might be ordered, but regardless, the idea is still the same. You can trade assets much more quickly there, and then the contract chain is where you want to focus on dApps effectively. Now you have this concept called subnets, or this product called subnets that Avalanche has launched. I think I can't even keep track, but maybe like it's been out for a while, but now in December, this past year, December 2022, it was really when it started to become useful to the external world. What I mean by that is it has interoperability baked in on the messaging side of things. And so before it was siloed and you had to basically use bridges. Now you don't have to rely on bridges. You can actually have native communications across subnets. What is amazing about subnets is a lot of things, but I think one thing that stands out is its customizability. The customizability is incredible for use cases, especially in the institutional and enterprise realm. Those companies need kind of that customization. They can't just deploy their idea onto a public network without maybe a huge amount of risk, or it just kind of totally defeats their business model. And so what you can do is you can basically have, let's say like a KKR as a hedge fund. They can deploy a subnet and use that subnet and have KYC AML on chain, and also have that connectivity with the public chain. And so if you have more and more subnets, you kind of see this very similar modeled to Cosmos's ecosystem, where you have all these different app chains effectively.
Yeah, I think that's like a great overview here, and we will dive deeper into the customization part in just a minute. But about the value accrual, like in Cosmos, you can just go ahead and build on the Cosmos SDK. Here's your app chain. You can enable IBC, but there's no necessary there's no not a necessary like value accrual for the Cosmos Hub or like for Atom. But in Avalanche, as far as I understood it right, is if you launch a subnet, the subnet is somewhat being secured like by the Avalanche main chain, correct?
Yes, so if you're a validator of a subnet, or if you want to validate a subnet, you must also validate the primary network. And so value accrual always comes back to the main chain because of that model, right? And similarly, subnets can use their own token as their gas token if they would like, but if they use AVAX, then that even adds more value to the AVAX token as a unit of account, because the AVAX token is also deflationary from design. And so, of course, you can kind of see how the economics work out there.
Yeah, for me, I think this is the main difference for me between Cosmos and an Avalanche is like that there's like a direct value accrual to the Avalanche chain, while in Cosmos, the ecosystem, I think, can also like scale faster because I mean, launching interchain security was very, very complex, and there are also like scalability questions in this regard. But obviously, a lot of chains were just able to randomly launch. You don't have this in Avalanche that much. But going back to the customization part before we dive deeper into the scalability part. So when I want to launch a subnet, I could like literally do like almost everything, right? So I could say I want to have like a KYC subnet. I want to know who is using the subnet in and out. But I can also keep it completely permissionless. So yeah, how much can I customize my subnet?
So right now, it's kind of the early implementation of this customizability. We have much more loftier goals on how to make that much more performant. I think really at this stage, we are working with the customers, if you will, or the companies that are interested in this technology, and really sensing and responding what they need out of this. The obvious direction, like I mentioned before, was more compliance, right? Compliance is something that's normal to focus on, especially in the context of enterprise. Now, there might be other things. Gaming is another wild arena, effectively, where they might want a bunch of different ways to customize things. They might want to not have gas token. They might want to have more complex token economics within their ecosystem. They might want to have multiple blockchains within a subnet. One of the misconceptions is subnet is not just one chain. You can have a network of blockchains within that system if you really wanted to. And so similarly, like other DeFi protocols, just to round out with 3 examples, are using subnets for data management, kind of like an off-chain, on-chain mechanism, but it's all on-chain. But on the subnet side, you could actually make it more permission or even private. And so you can kind of see where all these different levers, once you start pulling it, it gets a lot more complex. But still, for now, it's very high level when it comes to its capabilities. And really, I think compliance is something that we're chasing after more and more. And so personally, what I want to see is maximizing and simplifying the user experience. That's always the most important thing. I think when we first met a few years ago, that's something that I've been talking about. I firmly believe that that's still something that's really important, especially because the era of if they build it, they will come from like the early 2015, 16 era is I know some people might say that, but I purely do believe that that is incorrect in terms of the view. That is that if that was the case, then there would be so many other industries that would probably exist at this point. I think one relevant thing to mention is yesterday we had launched this service called Ava Cloud. Ava Cloud allows enterprises, but just any organization, but kind of geared more towards the larger organizations, to deploy a blockchain solution or a blockchain enabled solution without writing any code. And so this is just a front end GUI that is able to have all these different all those levers basically visualized and saying, hey, do you want this or do you not want this? Do you want this or do you not want this? And ultimately, when you customize those capabilities without, again, writing a line of code, then you can deploy that solution. Why that's super, super important is there's a study that I forgot who the source was actually, but there was a study that was kind of floating around internally where we saw that enterprises take sometimes over 12 months to deploy a solution that could be upwards of hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in expenses, all included. And it's mostly because of the development timeline. And so if we're able to cut that down, we can actually get to market, or they could get to market much more quickly. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I totally agree on this. And I think the cloud is like one more thing. What I love about the Avalanche ecosystem so much is this consumer facing application aspect that you really go like for the masses and try to create value by like providing applications that the masses really want to use. But we will dive deeper into in a second into that. One last question about subnets, because I mean, all of what you just mentioned before sounds absolutely great. Also, that you can launch basically a subnet that acts like a settlement layer for other subnets or other blockchains to launch on. But I mean, what about the scalability of this? So when I am a validator on the Avalanche mainnet, will there be any overhead further down the road if we would have like, say, 2,000 subnets? Would I, as a validator, would need to start upgrading my hardware or so?
So high level, just since I don't have a technical background, really what Avalanche is enabling is to basically avoid that situation where each validator has the burden of that overhead. It's because of the primary network, which is again the metadata chain that manages all of that overhead, and so it's a much more efficient system in that regard because that chain is the one that manages all of that kind of communications, logistics, and whatnot when it comes to scaling horizontally. And so, in theory, the limit really isn't something that we're worried about at all. And I think that's to be proven. But actually, what's been incredible is the last few months, a lot of new subnets or a lot of discussions of subnets have started to either come in privately or even better yet, some have just deployed without the one-on-one help of the Ava Labs team. And I think that's the overall goal. If someone can come in to the ecosystem and deploy it on their own and manage it and also scale it, that's really the outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think this is like very important here to mention that there is like this flexibility for you as a validator, that there won't be any overhead around the corner for you. I mean, that's also like very important in terms of planning as a validator, how long you can like sustain there, so to speak. But yeah, really love that. And now that we like go further into the scalability aspect and basically scale this ecosystem to the masses. What I also love about Avalanche is really what I've just mentioned is this consumer facing approach, so to speak. At Avalanche Summit, there were lots of like banks also talking about subnets, which was very interesting. But yeah, also besides that, you were able to set a lot of collaborations in stone with like famous Web2 companies. So could you talk a little bit about this? Because I think that this is also like part of your BD strategy, so to say, that you go to these existing companies worldwide and drag them into Web3. Also, Polygon did this with Instagram. Then we have Solana, of course. So could you talk a little bit about what Avalanche is doing here?
With our kind of mainstream approach, or I guess like non-native Web3 company approach, it's always, I think this is true across the board, it's always been a little bit of an uphill battle. Like I mentioned before, time to market for these companies is much longer. Decision making usually takes much longer than maybe even our respective companies because we're just leaner and smaller. And so a lot of it has to focus on education first and foremost, not even just Avalanche, but just blockchain in general. What does this mean? Why does it matter that it's not just a blockchain system that's permissioned internally or privately? That's basically just a database. What's the benefit of actually having interoperability? We really try and sell the app chain thesis as much as possible because it is very similar to the internet and how it's grown, but also very different in certain aspects. And I think one thing that's been incredible for the last year that I've witnessed, especially as being part of the team, is you started to see this uptick. Now, it was kind of like this classic slowly, and then everything all at once. I don't think we're at the everything all at once yet, but we've definitely seen a lot of things happen all at once in certain milestones in between. Now, I think with the institutional side of things, we really focused on hey, who are the people that are much more keen on using this technology? What are kind of the lowest hanging fruits? I would say institutions that have trading platforms, institutions that are seeking more operational efficiencies when it comes to their current system versus the future system, hopefully involving blockchain systems. KKR was one of them through Securitize. Securitize is also an incredible partner because they just have their eyes and ears open. They've been doing this for a long, long time. And then I think once we started to notice that, we were saying, okay, well, interoperability is really important. And we also need just kind of this permission system. Again, the idea that these enterprises and institutions will deploy on a public chain is probably unrealistic at this stage. And so we created this this product called Evergreen, and Evergreen is a permission subnet. And this then has commitment from a handful of different traditional firms, and there are, I think, about 6. And once these 6 kind of signal to the market saying, hey, like, we actually are committed to this, and we're committed to jumping on this permission subnet alongside other counterparts in the ecosystem, that's when all of a sudden the light just kind of flew on in all the other kind of sideline companies. And they were looking at us and saying, okay, actually, we need to get a part of this. So that was kind of something that really trended upwards. I would say when you were at Summit, you probably saw a lot of that coming together. Still, there's some delays probably on some of the other stuff that really came in the first quarter, second quarter. So you'll probably see more of that throughout this year. And then really, I think what the last thing I'll mention is these types of events like Summit and like Cosmoverse, I think, do an incredible job with convincing people who are on the fence to actually make a decision. Why? Because they come to these events and they feel just positivity. They feel an amazing experience. They walk away, and we were even riffing on it earlier before this call, and it's just human nature to feel very positive after coming out of socializing with like-minded people, hearing a lot of really bullish sentiment, really interesting topics, all these types of things. And so that's where we feel like events is a really important part of the decision-making process. And so certain people that came to us through the Avalanche Summit in Barcelona is the Catalan government and their blockchain center of excellence were like, hey, we love what you're doing. We want to get on board. I would almost bet that if we didn't do the summit at all last year or this year in Barcelona, we probably wouldn't have had that conversation at this stage. It probably would have come much later. And so governments are starting to take notice. They, I think, I would say, probably have a much longer time to market than even the enterprises, but that's the kind of education that we need to be doing. So holistically, why I've been always a fan of what you do and what the whole Cosmos kind of core group has been doing is we kind of come together and we're saying, hey, we have the same future outcome, or we see the same vision. We have different theses, that's okay, but we can actually come together and still talk about and have that kind of environment that really attracts more innovation. And that's what we should keep on doing digitally and physically. And that's a big focus of ours at Ava Labs.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on this. And I think, like, in terms of summits, I mean, in Germany, we always have the saying, like, after a beer in person, you also have a different conversation with the other person, or a different relationship. So yeah, I couldn't agree more on this. And also, yeah, there are strong synergies between Cosmos and Avalanche. And I mean, for you as a validator, nothing speaks against having a validator on Avalanche and on Cosmos. So there are a lot of, opportunities. And yeah, I actually remembered last year, like at Avalanche Summit 2022, Zeki was holding his keynote about IBC potentially coming to Avalanche. Now the subnets are launching, such as Landslide. So my question here is, first of all, how will these subnets communicate with the within the ecosystem, within the Avalanche ecosystem? And then moreover, how does Avalanche plan to interact with the rest of the crypto industry? Will you rely on fragile token bridges, or will you look for a communication standard such as IBC? So maybe you can briefly talk about this approach here.
I've been seeing a lot of amazing things from Landslide and also other maybe smaller projects that are really trying to bridge the gap between ecosystems. I think that's maybe the last step when it comes to interoperability, or maybe not the last, but one of the kind of big major steps rather. My personal view is bridges are probably a short-term solution. I think there's, at least the way they're designed now, there's a little bit too much risk in how they're designed, but some more technically proficient or kind of ahead of the curve teams are really thinking of how to maybe minimize that risk. And so I could be also wrong in that thesis as well, or hypothesis as well. And so ideally you want native communications as best as possible, but that also has its fair share of risk as well if it's not implemented correctly. And so what we need to do is take calculated risks like we all do in crypto and be very, very cautious about how we take these next few steps. And so landslide is one implementation. Hopefully there are others just for healthy competition. I personally view Avalanche as a system that can really be interoperable with anything. I think I could say the same thing with other ecosystems as well. And so hopefully you have this future outcome of all these different ecosystems that are now just so interoperable. And honestly, ideally, that kind of stops or minimizes the tribalism that exists in our space. It is kind of interesting that crypto is super tribal, and it makes total sense when you really think about the economics of it. And when you also think about how funny it is that almost no other industry has this crazy tribalism, maybe sports, but other than that, like you don't have, I'm not like, I'm using a MacBook. It looks like you are using a MacBook too. I have no camaraderie with you because we're both Mac users. Whereas when you have, a Cosmos token or an Avalanche token, you all of a sudden have this weird camaraderie, which is fascinating, but also detrimental at times, which is something that I've been always interested in to try and improve.
Yeah, that's actually a funny comparison here. But yeah, like we are like getting closer to the end of this like brief but straightforward discussion. I actually wanted to ask you really one question, because this was the reason why we have recorded this interview in 2021 in the first place, was because of the Avalanche Rush program. And in retrospect, so back then I was excited, and now I'm like just like I'm just impressed how things went, because there were so many other grant programs that were like filled with much more money, like NIR's $800 million ecosystem fund, Harmony ecosystem also with I think like $180 million or something. But your grants program was the first one, but much smaller. Yet I think that you spent the money much more wisely. So could you like maybe talk about how the grants program involved, what applications came into the ecosystem, and what's next with the grants program?
Crypto has a tendency to throw money at the problem. I'm not saying we're an exception either, but I think if you do that, you have to be very, very, very careful with how you do it. You have to have substance backing the money, backing the incentives. If you recall, and you can probably look back at the video, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this on your show, but these incentives are simply like the Uber and Lyft incentives, right? And there are other ride sharing companies that existed, but these ride sharing companies also threw money at the problem, and their ride sharing services were much worse in terms of value proposition and value add to the consumer versus Uber and Lyft or whatever else. And maybe there's other things that are complicating it, but for the fact of the matter is those are kind of the main points. Similarly for us, when we did the incentive program, we knew that we needed partners. We couldn't just do this ourselves. We couldn't just say, hey, $200 million or whatever it was, come join Avalanche effectively. And so we teamed up with Ethereum, leading Ethereum dApps. That was super important. Leading dApps on the Avalanche native side, and then also really trying to figure out how best we can get more dApps in the door through other ecosystems. And that way you have this really strong base of dApps that are actually useful to the end user. And then more importantly, our confidence is in the underlying tech. The underlying tech providing a lot of different benefits, but one of them being near instant transaction finality. That's just an amazing user experience. If you have a transaction that settles and it's final within a second, you're going to walk away and you're going to feel amazing about it. You're going to keep returning. And now when I don't mean to bring this up on the show necessarily, but when FTX and all that stuff happened the last year or so, everyone clawed their money back out of the market. That's just how it goes. Crypto still is a very luxury focused or kind of luxury asset class. It's something that goes first out of all things. And then now you're starting to see things climb back in. And one thing that's really incredible is if you look at our monthly active users, in April, we were over 800,000 monthly active users, almost at 850. For May, we're nearing the end of the month, we might actually beat that. And so if we're continuing, this is the highest amount of monthly active users we've had in the existence of Avalanche. And so we have many more incentive programs that are either coming or maybe not, I don't want to say coming because I don't want to lead it on actually, but we're thinking of those types of things, and also programs that are similar to incentive programs. One of them is Avalanche, the Evergreen, like I mentioned before. And Avalanche, is an NFT ambassador program for any artist to use Avalanche to deploy their work alongside some of the leading artists in the world. Dave Krugerman's a photographer, one of the biggest photographers on Instagram and just in general. There's also a few other ambassadors, and so that's a good way to add stickiness to our programs. And I think that's what really sets us out from the pack. And funny enough, I won't name names, but there are other companies that copied us with Avalanche and they just threw money at it. And when you actually look deeper, it's like, it's just the money. There's nothing else. And so if their tech is amazing, which is really hard to kind of compete at this point, everything is kind of pretty performant at this point. So it's pretty marginal above like a second transaction finale, for example. You're going to need more to attract additional customers. And I think that's what sets us apart from the rest.
Yeah, I think that's a very good conclusion about Avalanche's strategy, and what I admire about the ecosystem so much is quality before quantity. And obviously there are like so many exciting things in the pipeline. And yeah, even your user base is increasing, which is like very incredible considering that we're in a bear market. We see this in the other direction in many other ecosystems. So yeah, this is also what I was very impressed of, at Avalanche Summit to see this. But yeah, Jay, thank you so much for giving us like an update about the Avalanche ecosystem. I think we got a very good understanding where Avalanche goes next. And yeah, looking forward to meet you at Cosmoverse soon.
Thanks, Yuri. Appreciate you.